He found the orc sleeping in ash to stay warm. The farmer carried her without a word. The wind was a blade against the bones of the world that night, and Kaelen's farm was the most exposed bone of all. It was a place of stubborn survival, not comfort, clinging to the granite shoulder of a mountain that had long forgotten the sun. He was returning from the lower shed where he'd been checking on the last of the salted meat when a flicker of movement near the cold forge caught his eye. It was nothing, he told himself, a trick of the snow-laden wind. But he stopped anyway, his hand resting on the handle of the wood axe tucked in his belt. In this life, caution was the only currency he had left. He saw her then, a great green-skinned shape huddled in the grey mounds of ash and charcoal dust he'd swept from the forge weeks ago. The last embers had died long since, but a phantom warmth might have lingered there, a ghost of heat in the heart of the blizzard. She was enormous, a creature of muscle and stark lines even in repose, clad in battered iron plates and thick hides. A warrior, an orc. And she was not alone. 2 others stood like stones against the driving snow, their shoulders hunched, spears held in hands that must have been numb with cold. They watched him, their dark eyes twin glints of suspicion in the gloom. Fear was a cold, familiar thing in Kaelen's gut. Orcs meant trouble. They meant warbands, raids, and the kind of violence that had driven him to this forsaken corner of the world in the first place. His instinct screamed at him to back away, to bar the door of his small stone house and wait for morning, to pretend he'd seen nothing. It was the sensible thing to do. It was the safe thing to do. But the one in the ash hadn't moved. Her breathing was a shallow, ragged thing, each exhalation a brief, white plume that the wind tore away instantly. A dark stain, almost black in the failing light, spread from beneath her, melting the snow in a grim circle. Wounded. Dying, maybe. He looked from her to the 2 sentinels. They didn't raise their spears. They didn't shout a challenge. They just watched him, their exhaustion a palpable weight in the air. They were at the end of their strength, a last stand against the cold, and they were guarding their leader. Kaelen's life was a quiet litany of chores, a cycle of mending what was broken and coaxing life from unforgiving soil. He had buried his wife and daughter years ago, victims of a plague that had swept through the valley, and with them he had buried most of his capacity for anything but endurance. He existed. He survived. That was all. To invite this walking, breathing embodiment of conflict into his home was madness. He took a step forward. The 2 guards tensed, their knuckles white on their spear shafts. He held up his empty hands, palms forward, a universal sign of peace he hoped they understood. He walked slowly, deliberately, not toward them, but toward the fallen one. The wind howled, trying to push him back, to warn him away. He knelt in the snow beside her. Up close, she was even more formidable. A deep gash ran from her shoulder down her side, crudely bound with strips of leather that were soaked through with blood. Her face, fierce even in unconsciousness, was smeared with dirt and ash. A broken tusk jutted from her lower jaw, the ivory splintered and sharp. He could smell the iron of her blood, the wet leather of her armor, and the cold, clean scent of the snow. He made his choice. It wasn't a thought, Not a calculation of risk versus reward. It was something deeper, an old instinct he thought long dead. You didn't let a creature die in the cold if you could help it, not even one that might kill you for your trouble. He slid his arms beneath her, one under her knees, the other behind her back. The sheer weight of her was staggering. He grunted with the effort, his boots sinking into the snow. The iron plates of her armor were like ice against his skin, and the solid mass of her muscle was unyielding. He straightened his legs, his back screaming in protest, and lifted her. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. The two guards watched him, their faces unreadable masks of granite and shadow. He expected a spear in his back. He expected a roar of fury. He got nothing but the shriek of the wind. He turned, slowly, and began the short walk to the heavy oak door of his house. He carried her without a word, his own breathing now as ragged as hers. The two guards followed, silent as ghosts, their feet crunching in the snow behind him. He had just invited the storm inside. The inside of his house was one room, dominated by a stone hearth where a low fire glowed. The air smelled of wood smoke, dried herbs, and the simple solitude of one man's life. He laid the orc female gently on the furs he used for his own bed, the closest spot to the fire. Her head lolled to the side, and a low groan escaped her lips. The two other orcs filled the doorway, their massive frames blocking what little light remained of the day. They were both female, he realized, younger than the one on his bed, but just as hard-looking. Their armor was less ornate, but just as battered. They watched his every move as he stoked the fire, adding logs until the flames leaped high, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. He filled a kettle with water from a barrel and hung it over the fire. He didn't look at them. He didn't speak. He moved with the quiet economy of a man who has performed the same tasks 1,000 times. He was aware of them, of course. Their presence was a physical pressure in the small room, a coiled threat that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. The water began to steam. He took down a wooden bowl and a small linen bag of dried yarrow and willow bark from a shelf. He had little medicine, but he knew the properties of the mountain herbs. He glanced over his shoulder. The two guards hadn't moved. They were watching their leader. Her breathing seemed to be evening out slightly in the warmth of the room. He walked back to the hearth. As he reached for the kettle, one of the guards moved. She was faster than he would have thought possible, a blur of green and iron. Her hand, thick-fingered and calloused, clamped around his wrist. Her grip was like a smith's vice. "What are you doing?" Her voice was a low growl, rough as stones grinding together. Kaelen didn't try to pull away. He simply met her gaze. Her eyes were dark, intelligent, and filled with a fierce, protective suspicion. "The water is for her wounds," he said, his own voice quiet, steady. "The herbs will help with the fever." She stared at him, searching his face for deceit. He held her gaze without flinching. He had nothing to hide. His intentions were exactly as he stated them. After a long moment, the pressure on his wrist eased, and she released him. She gave a short, curt nod and stepped back, resuming her post by the door. The test was over, for now. He worked carefully, cutting away the blood-soaked leather bindings. The gash was deep and ugly, a long, ragged tear in the muscle of her side.
It was a sword wound by the look of it. It was inflamed and had already begun to fester. He cleaned it as gently as he could with hot water and clean rags. The leader remained unconscious, though she flinched and muttered in a guttural language when he probed the wound. He made a poultice from the herbs and packed it into the injury before binding it tightly with strips of clean linen.
He unbuckled the plates of her armor piece by piece, setting them carefully on the floor. Without the iron, she seemed somehow larger and more vulnerable at the same time. The sheer power in her musculature was obvious, but so were the dozens of other scars, old and new, that crisscrossed her green skin. This was a life lived by the blade. When he was done, he pulled a thick wool blanket over her. He stood and looked at the two guards. "There's broth," he said, gesturing to a pot simmering at the edge of the hearth. "And bread." They didn't respond. They just stared, their faces grim. He understood. They wouldn't eat until their leader did. He ladled some of the thin broth into a bowl and carried it over. He knelt by the bed and gently lifted the wounded orc's head. "Here," he whispered, holding the bowl to her lips. "Drink." Her eyes fluttered open. They were a startling amber color, bright and sharp as a hawk's. They focused on his face, and for a second he saw raw, undiluted fury in them. Her hand shot up and closed around his throat. Her grip was weak, shaky, but the intent was unmistakable. "Who are you?" she rasped, her voice a dry crackle. "My name is Kaelen," he said, his own voice strained. He didn't struggle. "You're in my house. You were freezing in the snow." She held his gaze, her eyes narrowed. The pressure on his throat didn't increase, but it didn't lessen either. She was assessing him, judging him. He could see the pain and fever warring with the warrior's instinct in her eyes. Finally, her hand fell away, and her head dropped back onto the furs. "Graka," she muttered, her eyes closing again. It wasn't an introduction. It was a statement of fact. Then she was asleep, or unconscious once more. Kaelen rubbed his throat. He picked up the bowl of broth again. He had a name for the storm now. Graka. He didn't know if that made it better or worse. He left the bowl by the bedside and walked back to the hearth, his own exhaustion finally settling deep into his bones. The two guards watched him, their expressions unchanged, but he thought, maybe, that the suspicion in their eyes had been tempered with a sliver of something else, something that might, in time, become respect. Days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of the winter sun. The blizzard passed, leaving the world buried in a pristine, silent blanket of white. Inside the small stone house, a new routine established itself. Kaelen tended to Graka's wound, changing the dressing, forcing broth and herb tea past her lips. She drifted in and out of consciousness, a fever her constant companion. When she was awake, she was silent, her amber eyes following his every move with an unnerving intensity. The two younger orcs, whose names he learned were Korgira and Zasha, maintained their vigil. They spoke little, and never to him directly, conversing in their own harsh, clipped tongue. But the initial hostility began to erode, worn away by the quiet, consistent care he provided. They started to help. One morning, he woke to find the water barrel, which he usually had to fill by hauling buckets from the semi-frozen creek, was already full to the brim. The next day, his woodpile, which had been dwindling, was neatly stacked with freshly split logs, his own axe resting clean against the pile. He never saw them do it. The tasks were simply done, completed in the pre-dawn darkness, or while he was out checking his snares. It was their way of paying a debt, a silent, practical acknowledgement. He learned to move around them, and they around him. The tiny house became a shared space, a fragile bubble of truce against the vast, indifferent cold outside. He would mend his tools by the firelight, the scrape of his whetstone a familiar sound, or they would sit nearby, methodically sharpening their short, heavy swords, the hiss of steel on stone, a counterpoint to his own work. They never offered to help with his tasks, and he never asked. But there was a growing sense of shared purpose. Keep the fire lit, keep the leader alive. One evening, Graka was awake and lucid. The fever had broken, leaving her weak but clear-eyed. Kaelen handed her a bowl of stew, thick with root vegetables and the last of his salted rabbit. She took it without a word and began to eat, slowly but steadily. It was the first solid food she had taken. Kolgira and Zasha finally accepted bowls of their own, eating quickly and efficiently, their eyes still flicking constantly toward their leader. When Graka had finished, she set the empty bowl down and looked at him. "The dressing," she said. It was a command. Kaelen nodded and brought over the warm water and clean linen. As he unwrapped the binding, he saw that the wound was finally beginning to heal. The angry redness had faded, and new skin was starting to form around the edges. He cleaned it and applied a fresh poultice. Her skin was hot to the touch, but it was the heat of healing, not of infection. She watched him work, her expression unreadable. His hands were rough and calloused from a lifetime of labor, but his touch was gentle, practiced. "You are no healer," she stated. "No," he agreed. "I'm a farmer." "A farmer would have left me in the snow," she said, her voice flat, "or put a blade in my back for my armor." Kaelen finished tying the new bandage. He didn't look at her. "This farm doesn't get many visitors. It would have been a waste of a good blade." He felt her eyes on him. He thought he might have seen the faintest twitch at the corner of her mouth, something that might have been the distant cousin of a smile. But when he glanced up, her face was as impassive as ever. The next morning he woke before dawn, as was his habit. The fire had been banked, but a low bed of coals still glowed. He reached for his worn sheepskin cloak, but his fingers brushed against something else. Draped carefully over the back of his chair was a heavy fur mantle, thick and dark, lined with supple leather. It wasn't his. He recognized the clasp, a heavy, unadorned piece of iron, as the one from Graka's own cloak. He looked over at the bed. She was asleep, but her cloak was gone. Kolgira and Zasha were curled up in their own blankets near the door, sleeping the sleep of the exhausted. He picked up the mantle. It was heavy, warm, and smelled faintly of pine smoke and cold iron. He understood the gesture. It was a repayment, a thank you, offered in the silent language of their people. He draped it over his own shoulders. The warmth was immediate, a shield against the morning chill. Later that day, when he was outside clearing a path to the woodpile, Gracca emerged from the house for the first time. She moved stiffly, her hand pressed to her bandaged side. But she stood tall, inhaling the crisp, cold air. She wore a simple leather tunic he'd left out for her, her armor still lying in a neat pile by the hearth. He stopped his work and watched her. She surveyed his small farm, her gaze taking in the stone house, the sturdy shed, the fallow fields blanketed in snow. Her eyes were sharp, missing nothing. It was the look of a commander assessing terrain. "This is a hard place to live," she said, her voice carrying easily in the still air. "It's quiet," he replied, leaning on his shovel. "Quiet is a luxury," she snorted, a brief, harsh sound. She walked over to the woodpile he had been clearing. Without a word, she picked up his spare axe. It was a heavy, well-balanced tool, but in her large hand it looked almost small. With a grunt, she swung it, sinking the blade deep into a thick, unsplit log. The wood cracked with a sound like a gunshot. She left the axe there and turned back to him. "Why here? Why so far from your own kind?" Kaelen looked away, toward the distant, jagged peaks of the mountains. He didn't owe her an explanation. He didn't owe her anything. But the weight of her fur mantle was still on his shoulders. "My wife and daughter are buried on that hill," he said, his voice low. He nodded toward a small rise dotted with stones. "A fever took them 5 winters ago. The valley below, it was full of ghosts. The quiet is better." He didn't say more. He didn't need to. He had given her a piece of his history, a reason for his solitude. It was more than he had shared with anyone in years. Gracca was silent for a long time. He thought she might offer some empty platitude, some warrior's proverb about loss. Instead, she simply nodded, a slow, deliberate movement of her head. "Ghosts are hard to kill," she said. She then turned and walked back into the house, her stiff gait the only sign of her injury. That night, as they sat by the fire, the silence felt different, less tense, more comfortable. He was mending a leather strap for his snowshoes, and she was watching the flames, her expression thoughtful. "My clan is Staghorn," she said abruptly, not looking at him. "My brother, Gorak, seeks my head. He thinks a chieftain's seat is won with a brother's blade." It was her turn to offer a piece of her past, a story of betrayal, of ambition. It wasn't the whole truth, he suspected. She spoke of a clan, but her bearing, her armor, the fierce loyalty of her guards, they all spoke of something more. High status, leadership. But he didn't press. He just nodded, pulling the sinew tight on the snowshoe. "Brothers can be trouble," was all he said. For the first time, she looked at him and gave a genuine, barking laugh. The sound startled him, rich and deep and full of a grim humor. It echoed in the small stone house, filling the quiet spaces for a moment before fading back into the crackle of the fire. A fragile thaw had begun. The peace, as Kaelen knew it must, did not last. It was broken by a mark on a tree. He found it 2 weeks after Gracca had begun to walk again, her strength returning with astonishing speed. He had been checking his snare lines at the edge of the woods that bordered his property when he saw it. Carved deep into the bark of an old pine was a symbol, a jagged axe crossed with a tusk. It wasn't the Staghorn clan's mark. He knew theirs now. Graka had sketched it for him in the dirt, a proud, branching antler. This new mark was brutal, aggressive, and it was fresh. The wood inside the cuts was pale and raw. He stood there for a long time, the cold seeping into his bones. Someone had been here. They were scouting, marking territory, searching. He smoothed snow over the tracks he'd found leading to the tree, a futile gesture, and headed back to the house, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. He didn't have to say anything. The moment he walked through the door, Graka looked up from where she was cleaning her sword, and she knew. His face must have told the whole story. "What did you see?" she asked, her voice low and tight. He described the symbol. Korgira, who was mending a tear in her leather tunic, let out a low curse in her own tongue. Zasha, standing guard by the door, gripped her spear tighter. "Gorak's hounds," Graka said, her voice like grinding iron. "The tusk breakers, his personal guard." She looked at Kaelen, her amber eyes sharp with a new, grim urgency. "They found us." "How many?" he asked. "The tracks were of 2 men," he said. "Scouts." "There will be more," she stated. "They'll send a small party first to test the defenses, to confirm it's me." Kaelen looked around his small home. His defenses. A sturdy oak door and stone walls. It was a shelter against the cold, not against a war party. His gaze fell on the steep wooded ravine that ran along the northern edge of his property. It was treacherous in the winter, full of snow-covered deadfalls and sharp rocks. "The north side," he said, thinking aloud. "The approach is narrow there. The ravine forces them into a single path for 50 yards. Graka's eyes followed his. A flicker of understanding, of professional respect passed between them. She was a warrior, and she recognized strategy when she heard it. "Show me," she commanded. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Kaelen led them along the ravine, pointing out the weaknesses in the terrain, the places where a man could lose his footing, the thickets that offered the best cover. Graka and her 2 warriors moved with a predator's grace, their eyes scanning every shadow, every rock formation. They saw the land not as he did, a place of sustenance and hardship, but as a battlefield. They didn't build elaborate traps. There wasn't time. They settled for simple, brutal efficiency. With Kaelen's guidance, they weakened the base of a dead, snow-laden pine that overlooked the narrow path. A few sharp cuts from an axe and a well-placed shove would send it crashing down. They piled rocks above a steep drop, a makeshift avalanche waiting for a trigger. It was a farmer's knowledge combined with a warrior's purpose. They were waiting before dusk, hidden amongst the snow-dusted pines above the ravine. The cold was bitter, but none of them seemed to notice. Kaelen was armed with his wood axe. It felt clumsy and inadequate compared to the heavy, sharp steel of the orcs' weapons. He was not a fighter. He was a man defending his home. They came an hour after sunset, moving like wraiths through the twilight. There were 4 of them, big, heavily armed orcs wearing the tusk-breaker symbol on their pauldrons. They moved with the arrogance of hunters who believed their prey was cornered and helpless. They entered the narrow path single file, their boots crunching on the frozen ground. Kaelen's heart hammered against his ribs. He looked at Graka, who who was crouched beside him, perfectly still. She gave him a tiny, sharp nod. Now. Kaelen and Zasha put their shoulders to the weakened pine. With a great groaning crack, the tree shuddered and fell, crashing down onto the path with a roar that echoed through the silent woods. It landed squarely on the last orc in the line, crushing him instantly. The other three spun around, roaring in surprise and fury, their swords drawn. At the same moment, Korgira kicked the trigger stone for the rock slide. A cascade of stones and packed snow tumbled down the slope, catching another of the tusk breakers and sending him screaming into the ravine below. Two were left. They were trapped, the fallen tree behind them, the steep drop to their side. Graka rose from her cover and let out a battle cry, a sound of pure distilled fury that seemed to shake the very air. She descended on them like an avalanche herself, Korgira and Zasha on her heels. Kaelen watched, his axe held forgotten in his hand. It was a whirlwind of brutal, efficient violence. He had seen bar fights, had seen men brawl, but this was different. This was the art of killing, practiced and perfected. Parries rang like hammer on anvil, blades flashed in the moonlight. It was over in seconds. The two remaining tusk breakers lay dead in the snow, their dark blood a stark stain against the white. Graka stood over the bodies, her chest heaving, her breath pluming in the frigid air. She was magnificent and terrible, a storm of a woman. She turned and looked up at him, her face a mask of grim satisfaction. They had won. But it was a victory that brought no relief. They had shown their hand. The scouts hadn't returned. Gorak would know. He would know that his sister was here and that she was not alone. He would send more than 4 next time. He would send them all. The victory was a death knell for the quiet life Kaelen had built. The bodies were dragged into the ravine, the blood covered with snow. But the evidence of the fight remained. The fallen tree, the disturbed earth, the lingering scent of iron in the air. His farm was no longer a sanctuary. It was a marked position on an enemy map. In the days that followed, a new tension settled over the house. It wasn't the wary suspicion of their first days together, but the grim watchfulness of soldiers awaiting a siege. Graka pushed herself, training relentlessly in the snow-covered yard, her movements growing faster, stronger, as her wound finished healing. Korgira and Zasha were her shadows, sparring with her, their blades ringing in the cold air. Kaelen found himself drawn into their preparations. He wasn't a warrior, but he was a craftsman. He took Graka's battered armor, piece by piece, to his forge. For the first time in years, he fired it up, the roar of the bellows a familiar comfort. He spent hours straightening dented plates, replacing broken rivets, and reinforcing weak straps. His hands, accustomed to the heft of a hoe or an axe, found a new purpose in the smith's hammer. He worked with a focused intensity, pouring all his anxiety into the steel. Graka would often stand in the doorway of the forge, watching him. She never offered advice, never criticized his work. She just watched, her arms crossed over her chest, a thoughtful expression on her face. He was strengthening her shield, and in doing so, he was strengthening his own. It was a partnership forged in fire and necessity. One afternoon, as he was fitting a newly repaired pauldron to her shoulder, Their hands brushed. Her skin was warm, calloused, alive. A strange jolt went through him, an unexpected spark of connection that had nothing to do with war or survival. He pulled his hand back quickly, his face flushing. He saw a flicker of something in her amber eyes, surprise, curiosity, before she turned away to test the movement of the armor. The moment passed, unspoken, but it lingered in the air between them. The main force arrived a week later. They didn't come with stealth this time. They came with the dawn, a dark tide of iron and fury pouring out of the woods. There were at least 30 of them, led by a massive orc in ornate black lacquered armor. He rode a huge, tusked boar that snorted and stamped in the snow. They surrounded the house, a ring of grim-faced warriors. There was no escape. The leader dismounted and strode forward, his heavy boots crunching in the snow. He stopped 20 yards from the door and pulled off his helmet. His face was a road map of old scars, and one of his tusks had been capped with black iron. "Graka!" he bellowed, his voice a raw, powerful thing that seemed to make the very air vibrate. "Daughter of the broken staghorn, your brother grows tired of your games. He has sent me, Karg, to bring him your head. Come out and die with honor, or we will burn this human's hovel to the ground with you in it." Kaelen stood just inside the doorway, his hand gripping the haft of his axe. He felt a cold dread wash over him. Daughter of the staghorn. Not just a warrior, not just from a clan. He looked at Graka, who stood beside him, her face a mask of cold fury. The pieces clicked into place. The quality of her armor, the unwavering loyalty of her guards, her natural air of command. She was a chieftain's daughter, orc nobility, royalty to his people, and she had never told him. A bitter, hollow feeling opened in his chest. He had shared his loss, his reason for being here. He had shown her the graves on the hill, and she had hidden the most important thing about herself. He had thought they were two fugitives, equals in their desperation. He saw now that he had just been a convenience, a temporary shelter for a princess in exile. He felt like a fool, his kindness a tool she had used. The fragile trust he had built felt like a lie. "You should have told me," he said, his voice quiet, almost lost in the tension of the standoff. Graka glanced at him, her expression tight. "It would not have changed anything." "It changes everything," he bit out, the sense of betrayal sharp as a shard of glass in his gut. Before she could reply, Karg laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Hiding behind your pet human, princess? Has the winter made you this soft? What is he, your new mate? Gorak will enjoy hearing how low you have sunk." Graka's hand clenched on the hilt of her sword. "He is under my protection, Karg. You will not touch him." "Protection?" Karg sneered. "He will burn with the rest of this filth." He raised his hand and gave a sharp command. The attack was instant and brutal. Orcs surged forward, axes and swords raised. Korgira and Zasha flanked Graka, and the three of them met the first wave at the doorway, a whirlwind of flashing steel and savage war cries. Kaelen was thrown back into the room as the fight exploded. The doorway became a meat grinder, a choke point where the 3 orc females held back the tide. But they were outnumbered 10-1. It was a fight they could not win. An arrow thudded into the doorframe next to Kaelen's head. He saw archers positioning themselves at the edge of the yard. They began to rain arrows onto the roof. He heard the telltale crackle and smelled the acrid smoke of pitch. They were going to burn him out. His home, his quiet, lonely sanctuary. It was coming apart around him in fire and violence. The rage that had been simmering in him, at Graka for her deception, at these invaders for destroying his peace, boiled over. This was his land, his house. He had built it with his own hands over the graves of his family. With a yell that was more frustration than courage, he charged forward. He swung his wood axe not with skill, but with the desperate strength of a man with nothing left to lose. The blade bit deep into the shoulder of an orc who was trying to push past Zasha. The warrior roared in pain and staggered back, surprised by the attack from the pet human. The battle became a chaotic blur. He fought beside them, a farmer with a wood-cutting tool amidst 3 master warriors. He was clumsy, slow, but he was a body in the doorway, another obstacle. He saw an axe coming for Zasha's head from her blind side and shoved her out of the way, taking the blow on his own axe handle, which splintered, sending a shock up his arms. The smoke grew thicker. Flames began to lick at the edges of the thatched roof. The heat was becoming unbearable. They were being forced back, deeper into the burning house. Kaelen's eyes stung, his lungs burned. They were going to die here. Then, in a brief, sudden lull in the fighting, as the Tuskbreakers pulled back to regroup for a final push, Graka did something he never expected. She stepped forward, past the bodies of the slain, and raised her sword high. Her voice, raw with battle and smoke, cut through the crackle of the flames. "Karg!" she roared, her voice carrying an authority that silenced the battlefield. "You want my head? Come and take it. But first, a declaration." Karg, standing back with his honor guard, sneered. "Words are for the weak, Graka." "Then hear the words of a chieftain's daughter," she bellowed, her voice ringing with power. She turned her head slightly, her amber eyes locking onto Kaelen where he stood, bruised and panting, in the doorway of his collapsing home. "This man, Kaelen, stood when others would have run. He gave shelter to the hunted and raised his hand against our enemies. I, Graka of the Staghorn, claim him. He stands with me. He will have a place at my side, by my fire. An attack on him is an attack on me and my house. I declare it before you all as my witness." A stunned silence fell over the battlefield. Even Karg looked taken aback. This was not just a promise of protection. It was a formal, public declaration, a political act. In the middle of a battle for her life, surrounded by enemies, she had bound herself to him, a human farmer, elevating him in the eyes of her people. She wasn't using him, she was choosing him. The betrayal he had felt moments before evaporated in the heat of her words, replaced by a profound, heart-stopping shock. She had seen him, not as a tool, not as a pet, but as an ally worth claiming in the face of death. Karg recovered first. He threw back his head and laughed. "You claim a human farmer. You are more pathetic than I thought. It matters not. You will both die here, and your declaration will turn to ash in your mouth." He gave the signal, and the final, overwhelming charge began. The final assault was a desperate, hopeless affair. They were pushed back from the doorway into the single room now thick with choking smoke. A burning roof beam crashed to the floor, sending sparks showering around them. Kaelen's world had shrunk to this fiery, chaotic space. The ring of steel and the 3 green-skinned warriors who fought with the ferocity of cornered wolves. They would die here. He knew it with a certainty that was strangely calming. He had lost everything once before to sickness. Now he would lose it all again to violence. He swung his splintered axe, his movements becoming sluggish, his lungs screaming for air. And then he heard it. A sound that did not belong. A deep, resonant blast from a war horn echoing from the woods behind the tusk-breakers. It blew once, then twice. The orcs attacking them faltered. Karg spun around, his face a mask of confusion and rage. From the trees, a new force emerged. A dozen orc warriors, clad in leather and furs marked with the Staghorn clan's antler symbol. They crashed into the rear of Karg's forces, their charge utterly unexpected. Moilists. Graka's people. They had found her. The tide of the battle turned instantly. Karg's warriors, caught between 2 fronts, were thrown into disarray. The fight spilled away from the burning house as Karg tried to rally his men against this new threat. Graka seized the moment. "Out, now!" she yelled, grabbing Kaelen's arm and pulling him toward the back of the house where the wall was crumbling. With a powerful kick, she smashed a hole through the burning wattle and daub. They scrambled out into the clean, cold air, choking and gasping. The farmyard was a scene of carnage. The battle raged, staghorns against tusk-breakers. Kaelen watched as the roof of his house finally gave way, collapsing inward in a shower of embers and flame. Everything was gone. His bed, his tools, the chair where he sat in the evenings, the small wooden figures he'd carved for his daughter years ago and kept on the mantel. All of it was ash. He felt a profound emptiness, a hollow ache that went deeper than his bruises and burns. He had nothing left. The fighting ended as quickly as it had begun. Karg, seeing his forces overwhelmed, fought his way to his boar, mounted it, and fled into the woods with the few survivors of his guard. The Staghorn warriors did not pursue. They secured the area, their faces grim as they surveyed the destruction. An older orc with a greying braid and a face like a weathered rock approached Graka and bowed his head deeply. "War Chief," he rumbled, "we tracked the tusk-breakers. We came as soon as we could." War Chief. So that was her title. Higher even than he'd imagined. Graka nodded, leaning heavily on her sword. "You are welcome, Borin. Your timing was adequate." There was a hint of dry humor in her exhausted voice. She then turned to Kaelen. The firelight flickered in her eyes, reflecting the flames that were consuming the last of his life. "What I said," she began, her voice softer now, "was not a battlefield tactic. It was a vow. I offer you a place with my clan, protection, a new home." Kaelen looked at her, then at the smoking ruin of his house. Protection, a place in her clan. He would be the human she saved, a curiosity, a dependent. He thought of her public declaration. He stands with me, at my side. He straightened up, his shoulders squared despite the pain. The emptiness inside him was being replaced by a cold, hard resolve. His old life was over. He could either be a victim of its destruction or a co-author of the next chapter.
"I accept," he said, his voice raspy from the smoke, "but not as someone you protect." Graka's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I am not one of your warriors. I cannot fight like they can," he said, gesturing to the grim-faced staghorns. "I am a farmer, a smith, a human. I will not hide that. I will not be your pet, to be pitied and sheltered behind your walls." He met her gaze, his own unwavering. "I will stand beside you, as you said, as an equal, or I will not stand with you at all." It was an audacious demand, a low-born human setting terms for an orc war chief. Borin and the other warriors stared at him, their expressions a mixture of shock and disbelief. Graka studied him for a long moment, her amber eyes searching his face. She saw the grief for his lost home, but beneath it, she saw an unbending core of integrity, a quiet strength that had nothing to do with muscle or skill with a blade. It was the strength of a man who knew his own worth, even when he had nothing left.
A slow smile spread across her face. It was the first true smile he had ever seen from her, and it transformed her fierce features into something striking. "Then stand," she said, "beside me." They left that same day. There was nothing to salvage, nothing to pack. Kaelen took only the axe he had fought with, its handle splintered and charred. He didn't look back at the smoking ruins as they marched away. He walked beside Graka at the head of the column, the cold winter air a balm on his burned skin. He was leaving the ghosts behind and walking toward an unknown, dangerous future. But for the first time in a very long time, he was not walking alone. The journey back to the Staghorn clan's mountain stronghold was arduous. Kaelen learned quickly that travelling with an orc war party was a brutal education in endurance. They moved fast, ate little, and slept less. He was, by a wide margin, the weakest among them. His human stamina couldn't match their relentless pace. He faced prejudice, as he knew he would. The other orcs, even Graka's loyalists, viewed him with a mixture of suspicion and contempt. They called him fleshing or dirt scratcher, their voices dripping with scorn. They saw his lack of muscle, his smaller stature, his inability to keep pace on the steepest climbs as proof of his inferiority. They couldn't understand why their war chief had bound herself to such a creature. But Graka's word was law. Her declaration on the battlefield had been clear. He was to be treated as her chosen companion, and so the insults remained mostly muttered under their breath, and the shoves he received on the trail were disguised as accidental jostling. Korgira and Zasha, however, treated him with a grudging respect, having seen him fight for their home, for their shared home, however temporary. Kaelen never complained. He never asked for rest. Every evening when they made camp, while the warriors saw to their weapons, he would find work. He used his knowledge of woodcraft to find the driest tinder. He repaired broken pack straps with a skill they grudgingly admired. One night, Borin, the old veteran, watched as Kaelen expertly rewrapped the loose hilt of a warrior's sword with waxed cord, making it tighter and more secure than it had been before. "The fleshing has useful hands," Borin grunted. It was the closest thing to a compliment Kaelen had received. He didn't try to be an orc. He didn't try to match their strength or their ferocity. He was simply himself. When a supply cart's axle broke, it was Kaelen who, with a few tools and a knowledge of joinery, was able to fashion a workable repair that got them moving again. When a strange sickness began to affect the warriors, a fever and cough from drinking tainted water, it was Kaelen who recognized the herbs that could soothe the symptoms, the same ones he had used for Graka. He proved his worth not by trying to match their skills, but by demonstrating his own. They reached the Staghorn stronghold, a vast fortress carved into the heart of a mountain, after a month of travel. Here, the hostility was more open. Gorak's betrayal had fractured the clan, and Graka's return with a human in tow was seen by many as a sign of weakness, of desperation. The weeks that followed were a blur of political maneuvering and simmering conflict. Graka fought to reclaim her authority, her every move scrutinized, and Kaelen was a constant, visible symbol of her choices. He was given quarters near hers, a small, stony room that felt more like a cell than a home. He spent his days in the clan forges. The orc smiths were masters of weaponry, but their tools were often crude, their bellows inefficient. Kaelen, with his patient, methodical approach, began to make improvements. He redesigned a flue to improve the forge's draw. He showed them a human technique for tempering steel that made the edges of their blades hold longer. He didn't try to teach them. He simply worked, and they watched. Slowly, begrudgingly, a new name for him began to circulate through the stronghold. Forge hand. It was better than fleshing. One evening, months after their arrival, Graka came to the forge. A critical council of elders was to be held the next day, a meeting that would decide whether the clan would unite behind her or splinter into a civil war against Gorak. She was tense, the weight of her responsibility etched on her face. She wore her full armor, the same suit he had repaired back at his farm. She turned her back to him. "The pauldron," she said. "The strap feels loose." He came forward and examined the piece of armor he knew so well. It was the same pauldron he had mended by the light of his own forge fire. He remembered the feel of the metal, the placement of each rivet. His hands moved with a familiar confidence, tightening the buckle, adjusting the fit against her shoulder. This time, there was no tension, no awkwardness. It was a simple, intimate act of partnership. His hands, covered in soot and grime, were steady on the polished steel that protected her. He was not her warrior, but he was her armorer. He was the quiet foundation that made her strength possible. His work done, his hands lingered for a moment on her shoulder. She didn't pull away. Instead, her own hand came up and covered his, her strong fingers gently enclosing his own. It was a silent, powerful acknowledgement of everything that had passed between them, of the fire, the blood, the long road they had travelled. "My brother believes strength is the power to break things," she said, her voice a low murmur in the quiet forge. "He thinks leadership is about forcing others to your will." She turned to face him, her hand still holding his. Her amber eyes were soft. "You have taught me that true strength is also found in the skill to mend what is broken, to build what will last." He looked down at their joined hands, his pale and scarred from farm and forge, hers green and powerful, the hand of a war chief. They were different in every way, a living embodiment of their two worlds, yet they fit together. He understood then that he had not just found a new home, he had forged one. He had lost a life of quiet solitude only to find a life of shared purpose. He had been a man defined by what he had lost, but now, standing beside her, he was a man defined by what he was willing to build. Strength wasn't just about breaking shields or taking heads. Sometimes, it was about knowing how to mend a strap on a piece of armor for the person who was about to go to war for you, and knowing that your hands, in their own way, were just as vital as the one that held the sword.